Good afternoon, everyone. This is Richard Idland, the National Policy Director with Business for America. Really happy today to have an opportunity to chat with Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan, who is the representative from the 6th District in Pennsylvania. Ms. Houlahan has been a champion in the House of Representatives on election AI issues, where she's serving on the House AI Taskforce and has been a member of Congress since 2019. Prior to that was an Air Force veteran, an employee, an entrepreneur and an educator. And we wanted to take this opportunity to chat with the Congresswoman today to learn about what Congress is attempting to do to get a better handle on the use of generative artificial intelligence in the context of the 2024 election. And we want to also give a shout out and thank you to a number of organizations who help to promote this event. So the organizations, as you can see here, I won't read them all, but I wanted to thank all of you for helping to get the word out. And Congresswoman Houlahan, let me thank you again and offer you the opportunity if you wanted to start the conversation with any sort of, framing remarks, and then we had some questions.
I guess it's good afternoon at this point in time to everybody, most likely on this time zone. And thank you very much for having me today. As mentioned, my name is Chrissy Houlahan, and I'm really proud to represent the 6th District of Pennsylvania. For those of you who are playing along, that's Chester and Berks counties, all of Chester County and the lower part of Berks County. You mentioned my background a little bit as a vet and as an entrepreneur and as an educator. To be a little specific on that, I'm an engineer, so I served as an engineer in the military on ballistic missile defense programs. I also was an entrepreneur, and many of the things that I did had to do with systems implementations of one form or another in growing and scaling the operations that I was responsible for. And then as an educator, I was a chemistry teacher in North Philadelphia at Simon Gratz. And so I hope what you heard there is a consistent interest in STEM and STEAM fields, a consistent interest in making sure that we had the operations that went behind things to be able to support growing businesses and safe communities. And that's probably why I am so intrigued and interested in this particular space of AI in general. And of course, the interest in the 2024 elections, because I also am deeply patriotic, as I think many of you are, and very much believe in this great nation. And I want to make sure that it continues to have its next 250 years. So it's really important that we come together and address these kinds of challenges and issues to make sure that we're assuring the integrity of our democratic process and our elections. So we want to make sure that we're not just talking about recognizing these threats, but also trying to figure out how we can action on them, what we can do, particularly as members of Congress, to put legislation in place that can hopefully make sure that we feel confident that our voting process and that our election process is free of AI deception or AI interference and of misinformation. So I look forward very much to discussing these kinds of efforts with you. It's our responsibility, both as lawmakers and as citizens, to make sure that our elections remain a true reflection of the will of the people. And we need to collectively stay very vigilant and proactive and united, regardless of whom we vote for. I was also raised by one Democrat and one Republican, and they went to the polls together to cancel each other's votes out year in and year out. So we want to make sure that we are safeguarding the democratic values that we hold dear. And so thank you very much for having me and this important conversation. I would caveat this conversation, and you'll probably hear me talk about this a lot. I mentioned my background. In the 435 members of Congress, there are a couple dozen that have STEM backgrounds. And so the hope that I have, the optimism that I have for making sure and hoping that we can move forward on this has everything to do with educating my fellow members of Congress on why this is important. And so I look forward to activating you guys and energizing you guys to make sure that at the end of this call, you guys have recognized this as well, and that you're bringing your activism and your lobbying to full force.
Great. Good. Thank you, Congresswoman. That is really helpful and a good sort of, I think, framing of why you're concerned about these issues. But could you tell us maybe in a little bit more detail, has there been something that you've been noticing in the past months or past year or two about the advent of generative AI that causes you particular concern and thus, making you want to be a leader on this issue in the House?
Yeah, I think that there's a bunch of things going on. One is that I mentioned that, kind of this deep sense of patriotism and deep anxiety about the integrity of our elections, or at least people's perceived worry about the integrity of our elections and our election process. And so we have seen the rise of AI much more noticeably in the last several years publicly with people, normal humans like you and I. And we know that this has lots of opportunities to enhance a lot of aspects of our society. And we've seen them. But we also know that it can be exploited for harmful purposes, and particularly in the realm of elections. And so I think AI generated deep fakes are definitely a pressing concern. When I'm just a normal citizen on, Facebook or Twitter or any number of those kinds of things, I myself struggle to understand where real content starts and fake content ends. And if I am trying to employ every way that I have to validate and verify these sophisticated AI techniques, I can only imagine how hard it is for just an average person. So this is undermining in all ways, shapes, and forms the public's ability to discern fact from fiction. But it's significant and particularly worrisome in the area of voters and their decisions if they are subject to fabricated statements. We also want to make sure that people who are um, administrators of these election processes, these people who are largely volunteers, dedicated individuals who are essential to our democratic processes, are also likely not experts in cybersecurity, right? Who really is, except aside from my son-in-law. But it's our responsibility to make sure that we're equipping them with the tools and knowledge to be able to protect the elections too. So some of the legislation that likely we'll be talking about, like HR 8353, hopefully represent a step in the direction of making sure that we're identifying and recognizing cybersecurity risks, particularly AI, and that we're enhancing the capabilities of our election administrators to make sure that they are able to help protect our very robust processes already and make sure that they remain secure.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the bill HR 8353 and why that's important. And I'll caveat that and just note that there currently isn't any federal legislation governing the use of AI in election context. But there are many states, including California. I see just Governor Newsom just signed a bill yesterday with a number of the provisions that are being discussed in the House and the Senate to safeguard against the use of AI. But in the federal context, I guess the first question is, why is it important for Congress to act if the states are already taking action? What is Congress trying to prevent against here?
Well, a couple things. One is this is kind of a problem in Congress in general, the US Congress in general, not just on this particular issue. I also spend a lot of time on a space that's paid leave, making sure that we are able to create a program for paid leave for the 75% of Americans that don't have access to that, whether they have a child or somebody is sick in their family or they are sick. We are one of only 7 nations that don't have a federal program or the ability for us to be taken care of under those circumstances. And right now, what you're seeing in that instance is more than 14 states now, I think 15 now, actually have moved forward with their own form of legislation. And that just jumbles and confuses the marketplace, right? And particularly when we're talking about these kinds of issues, whether it's paid leave or whether it's election interference, if you're piecemealing this together state by state, you end up with a suboptimal, I think, solution, and you end up with confusion. So I think that's why these kinds of things are important. And in many cases, they provide a baseline, right? They provide a baseline for states that may not have legislative teeth to these kinds of issues. And hey, it's okay. Plenty of states are doing things in paid leave space, as an example, that may be more ambitious and more robust than what we might do at the federal level. But at a minimum, on this issue of AI and election assistance and that issue of paid leave, it's a great example of the fact that the federal government really does need to play a role in this issue. Also, you're probably following along that many nation states are already moving forward on this too. And if we don't lead, the United States doesn't lead on these kinds of issues, not necessarily election integrity per se, but other kinds of issues, then we are sort of ceding that ground, or the ways that companies are building their systems to other nations. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think we know that we would rather lead than follow on almost everything. And that, I think, is another hazard. So
Right.
I'm not sure if I answered your question
Yeah, yeah,
completely, but I think,
you did. And the second part of the question then is regarding the specific piece of legislation that would empower the Federal Election Assistance Commission to provide guidance and some direction for state and local election officials looking to mitigate the risk of AI technologies. So what does that bill focus on, if you
sure.
could detail that a
Yeah.
little bit?
So, kind of going back to kind of give you some by the numbers kind of things too. When you're talking about all the states in the country, you're also talking about the fact that each one of our states has very different standards, even from polling place to polling place. And so there are 94,000 polling places, if you can believe it, across the country in our elections systems, and that's 94,000 vectors or opportunities to interfere. And so some of the things that we need to make sure that we're doing, even though states have the authority to govern their elections, is making sure that we're providing guidelines to help support state and local administrators by offering them standard best practices to address cyber and AI related benefits. And this is one of the reasons why HR 8353, I believe, is a good solution, because it's providing them not mandatory requirements, rather they're providing them voluntary opportunities. And so the foundation of our democracy is on these, of course, free and fair elections. And we want to make sure that we're allowing people to, who are either providers of federal election assistance, whether they're working at the polls, trained election officials, to make sure that they can have the training and an understanding of what the AI threats are, make sure that they have protocols or ideas of protocols for identifying and addressing AI generated misinformation and what to do. What are the ways to protect the integrity of our elections? I mentioned best practices for AI related cybersecurity risks and for best practices for making sure that we're securing our sensitive data. Those are the kinds of things that this piece of legislation hones in on. As you mentioned, there are other pieces of legislation that are talking to other parts of the election process, and that is a complement to this particular piece of legislation.
Right. And this particular bill, HR 8353, is a bipartisan
Yes,
effort and bicameral. I know there's a companion bill in the
yes.
Senate. So this is not a partisan issue. And could you say a bit about that and why
Yeah.
Republicans and Democrats feel equally concerned?
Sure. And, as I mentioned, kind of come from a purple family, 1R, 1D. My community is a purple place. It's about 40 R, D, and I. It is a pragmatic community in Pennsylvania, which is probably why you all in Pennsylvania know that we're so important. We're the keystone to the keystone of many of these election decisions. This is not a partisan issue. Free and fair and unfettered elections is not partisan. Every person who is eligible to vote should be able to vote, and we should not have misinformation as part of our voting process. So this is not a partisan thing. This bill is bipartisan, as you mentioned. D's and R's are signed on to it, and that's really important for me and for the work that I do. But also, as you mentioned, it's also bicameral, which means that it's also in the Senate side, where it is also bipartisan. And so, if you guys remember your Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill. The House has to have a piece of legislation. Ideally, the Senate has the same piece of legislation. And in this case, that's where we are. They both ideally pass that legislation, and it goes to the president's desk for signature after being reconciled if there are any differences or discrepancies. So we have all the things that we need to be able to move this forward. But what we need is the will of the body to be able to recognize that. And what does that mean? Remember your schoolhouse rock? It's got to go through committee ideally, although increasingly less and less that seems to happen in these Congresses. And it then has to go to the floor for a vote. So that's where you guys can come in. We have a lot of other things on our plate right now. You could argue that there's probably nothing more essential and important than election integrity to all of these things. But we need the people to tell us that this is important. And that's where you guys come in.
Great. And with, again, the detail on 8353, so is it accurate that the bill is focused primarily on election administration and offering guidance? And
Yes.
it doesn't forbid the use of generative AI, and there's no legal recourse or financial recourse, that those efforts would be addressed by other pieces of legislation. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay, great. So there was a question about that, and Ron, hopefully that is clear. Congresswoman Houlahan, I know you're also interested in other legislation that similar to what Senator Klobuchar is doing, which would try to forbid the use of generative AI in a deceptive manner, and also hold the platforms accountable for monitoring what gets posted. So can you say anything about your concerns about that and what we might look to happen in Congress?
Sure. And this is an example of sort of complementing pieces of legislation. There is another piece of legislation called HR 8384 that does address AI election threats to candidates that are running for federal office. And so this is also very, very important. Representative Kilmer on the House side is leading that. And the title of the bill is Protect Elections from Deceptive AI Act. And it does address the critical aspect of electoral integrity, different from the administration of it, which is the deceptive AI media that's directed at candidates. This year alone, we've seen some instances of this malicious AI that's been being used against politicians from both parties. So as an example, there was a deepfake video that featured Senator Warren. This is something that's very, very concerning. And so this piece of legislation, as opposed to the administration aspect of it, is addressing the fact that we can't abide by having our candidates attacked by artificial or fake AI.
Right, right. Question that I wanted to ask, relates to free speech and parody. And that as we watched the debate in the Senate, we heard Senator Fisher from Nebraska oppose moving the bills forward because she was concerned about dampening free speech, recognizing that parody, as Elon Musk has reminded us, is constitutionally allowable. And she also, the senator also suggested that these pieces of legislation might stymie technological innovation. So, but if you go back to the free speech and parody issue, Congresswoman, what would how would you
What
address
say you?
that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that this is a real issue. I think, frankly, this is a red herring. It definitely still would uphold the principles of free speech. This particular piece of legislation is targeting egregious forms of fake information to prevent very, very harmful impacts on elections. And, I do historically, I've heard these kinds of arguments whenever anybody gets goosey about, controlling innovation or controlling business. These are things that are worthy of regulating, and they are not in contradiction to our free speech, our right to free speech.
Mm-hmm. And could you give us a quick update on what you think will happen with this suite of bills, both in the House in
That's
particular?
a good question.
And
So what I would say is, we're at the tail end of this Congress, right? Remember your schoolhouse rock. Every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for reelection. So in 48 days, all of us are up for reelection, and in January of next year, all of us will be sworn in. Anybody who's newly elected and those of us who are staying, and we will begin the process all over again. We will literally take the 11,000 to 14,000 pieces of legislation that are introduced every 2 years, and anyone that hasn't made it through all of that process will be dumped out of the hopper and somebody's got to dump it back into the hopper. And so you can bet that this will be dumped back in, because regardless of whether or not we get it across the finish line in the next couple of months, it's something that needs to get across the finish line. And as you've said, has bipartisan support and bicameral support. So we'll keep pushing on it. It may not end up being up for consideration in committee or on the floor of either body this Congress. We still do have time, and particularly potentially in the lame duck after the dust is settled on elections, maybe that would be a good opportunity to sort of get along on this issue. Also, though, we do have the opportunity after the election to bring this kind of legislation and perhaps other similarly related pieces of legislation together into one total package. The way Congress sometimes works is it's more appealing to pass a big bunch of legislation that has similarities to it. And sometimes Congress is more apt to pass one thing at a time. So it's just a matter of how we work together or work separately to get each one of these things through. But you do find your allies, you do find the people who are interested in this, and then you do find ways to work with them. And that's the plan, is to not relent on this. It's too important.
Right, right. I just want to go back to one point you made about the congressional action is focused on protecting candidates running for federal office, correct? And so the gap that we find between what the states are doing, which is useful, those activities don't include folks running for Congress or for the presidency, right? And so there really is no, if I'm correct, there is no existing guidelines or no assurance that federal candidates have any protection from deceptive AI?
No, this is a good question, and it's actually kind of troubling to me too, and worthy of me taking a deeper dive on this. Let's take the current news of the day right now, where there have been two assassination attempts on our Republican candidate for the presidency. I'm on the committee that is looking into the attempted assassination, the bipartisan committee that's looking into that, and we are, of course, doing our very best to try to understand what happened, how to make sure it doesn't happen again, how to ask all the right questions and how to protect our democracy in this way. But it asks and it begs the question, as you're watching us struggle with, should a candidate have the same protection as a sitting, elected official at our highest level? We have 435 members of Congress, 100 members of the Senate, hundreds and hundreds of members of local and state elected officials. And I can guarantee you that all of us are under pressure, whether by having our lives threatened or being in dangerous environments, which I know many are, or in this case, in this technology situation, in election integrity, AI, false AI. We have to figure out how to go cooperate with one another at the federal, state, and local level to make sure that we're protecting these people. To be honest, it's pretty hard to raise your hand and to be interested in running for any office if you are worried for your integrity, your reputation, and your safety. And it's really hard for a common citizen to go to the poll if they're really worried that everything that they see isn't real. And so we have some real work to do. And I think it's a fair question to understand kind of where those borders are between federal and state.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I know we just have a few more minutes with you. And my last question is, given the possibility that the bills may not move in Congress, what advice do you have for businesses, trade associations, and others concerned about these issues to cajole Congress to still act in the coming months here?
Um, I would say on this and on everything that matters to you, whether it's a business issue or a personal issue or an issue of our citizenry, it's really important that you let your elected officials know what is important to you. As I mentioned, I think this Congress, there were 14,000 pieces of legislation. You know, you're looking at my office. We are a very, very small business. We have 18 by law, the most that we can hire people who help us get through all of this work and these ideas. And so if you see something, say something. You know, I think that's your mandate is as an individual citizen and as an organization of one form or another to make sure you're communicating with your elected officials wherever they are about the things that are important to you. And the other thing I would give as advice is I was an educator for some time. I did teach high school chemistry. One of the biggest lessons I learned there is it's important as the teacher, as an example, that I call my students' parents or adults every once in a while just to tell them what I like about their kid and about what they're doing. It makes it better when you have to call their kid, the parent, and say, you know what, we have something that we need to work on together. Because you've built a sense of trust and a relationship. You know that you're telling that person when they're doing something right, just as much as you're telling them when they're doing something wrong. So I would encourage you all to do that as well, because otherwise we get a skewed view here in our offices of what people really want and what they don't really want.
Right, exactly. Good. So we thank you so much for your time. We
Thanks.
will be in touch with your team, who we really appreciated, collaborating on this project with you, and we'll be in touch. So thank you so much for your leadership on this issue.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.